going on, everyone? Welcome to episode 46 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. Today, myself, Zach, and Jake are going to have a couple of segments to chat about. The first segment we're going to chat about is some nutritional periodization stuff. So we recently released our first course on nutritional periodization. To some degree, this segment I guess is a sales pitch. We'd love if you buy the course, but we also want this to be very helpful for you if you don't want to buy the course. If it's not the time for you, you're not interested, that's totally cool too. But we're going to talk about some concepts from the course and just, why nutritional periodization in general. So that'll be spearheaded by Jake. And then we will also discuss our most recent newsletter that was spearheaded by Zach. Titled Drop Sets, Same Gains, Less Time. I think this was a really, really good one, discussing a recent meta-analysis on drop sets and talking about how to practically apply them and some considerations on that front. So before we get into it, be sure to check out the description for the stuff we offer. Sign up for the newsletter. It's totally free. And of course, because we just launched our nutritional periodization course, you can check that out for a limited time. It is 30% off with the code LAUNCH30. So be sure to hop in while you can get it discounted. And I'll kick it over to you, Jake, in a second. But let me just ramble on here for another minute or two. I will say that this has been in the works for a while. Originally, Jake had made this basically a spreadsheet calculator for adjusting nutritional variables the week of a meet to make weight based on all the best research on acute weight cuts, right? Gut residue, body water, glycogen, all these things based on how much weight you have to lose, your weight, how, whether it's a 2-hour weigh-in, a 24-hour weigh-in, and then you can customize to what degree you want to bias each of these, categories to lose body weight from. And originally we were going to put that out there. And then I apologize, Jake, but I just kind of kept being like, hey, I think we should add this. Let's make a little course out of it about weight cutting. And then that ended up being one of, I think, 5 modules of this course. And I was like, wait, let's just back up and let's talk about if someone, wants to think about the whole calendar year of nutrition. And actually, let's just layer in how to think about pairing this with your training as well. And now it's basically a comprehensive course about nutritional periodization. And yeah, I'm stoked about this. I think this is very overlooked. I think to some degree you could think this is unexpected from us because we don't talk about nutrition a ton, but from all of our collective coaching experiences, I think this is one of, if not the most predictive factor for long-term success, is if you can manage these things properly. And I think Jake was 100% the right guy for the job to make this course for the company, right? Because I think the way he presented it was awesome. And specifically things regarding, how to make sure that you don't have to track everything to the gram year round and still reach your nutritional goals. How to, instead of giving you specific prescriptions about, hey, you need to do this, you need to do that. Hey, these are different options. And, if you're moving up a weight class, here's option A and here's option B. And this is when you might want to choose option A or option B based on adherence considerations, psychological considerations, comfort, etc. So anyway, with that out of the way, check out the link below for the course. Jake, I don't know if you have any follow-up on that, but otherwise I'll let you discuss whatever you want to discuss regarding nutritional periodization.
Awesome. Well, I guess one final note on that is please continue to tag us if you post things on Instagram about doing the course. That's really cool to see and really cool to get that feedback from anyone who's taken it. We've gotten some really good feedback, and I'm hoping to continue getting good feedback, and I love seeing people engaging about it. So with that said, I guess we'll jump in here, and I think the main thing that I want to kind of discuss is why is this so important, right? What is the rationale behind why doing different things with nutrition is most likely better based on different training phases. And there's a little bit of literature here, but a lot of it really comes from logic, right? And just sort of pairing these ideas together. And the most basic sort of overarching thing is that Not always, but most of the time, especially in powerlifting or strength sports, is we're doing different training focuses across different phases, right? Like it's not always exactly the same. And there's a lot of ways to do this. You can structure things in many different ways, but most likely across different periods of time, there's going to be slightly different focuses, whether it's a hypertrophy phase, strength phase, things like that. And because the training is a little bit different, it makes sense that the nutrition should be slightly different to really maximize everything. So I guess if we think about the probably the most stereotypical and most common approach is to have some early phases of training that are more focused on hypertrophy, some higher volume stuff, maybe less specific exercise variations, less specific loading, right? Maybe your top sets are high, sets of 3 or 5 instead of singles, whatever you want to do, right? There's tons of options, but we're a little bit more focused on hypertrophy. Then we transition into phases that are a bit more focused on strength, and then we kind of get towards a test day or a competition or something like that where we're trying to peak performance for a specific day. And I think it really makes the most sense in my opinion to, during these higher volume phases, these hypertrophy phases that are earlier on, that are further from where our top end strength is the main concern. That's when we want to do most of the body composition changes that we're trying to do, right? And whether that is, if your overarching goal is to go up a weight class, obviously our main goal there is to gain weight, especially gain muscle. In the very long term, we think it also makes sense to maximize the muscle that you carry to really maximize our strength potential in the super long term. And then also, if your goal is fat loss, if you want to go down a weight class, or you just want to be healthier, you just want to, have a physique or an appearance that's more appealing to you personally, whatever your goal is, with that, it probably makes sense to do it there too, right? Again, your top end strength is not the main concern. Any additional fatigue that comes from that diet, not the biggest deal, right? Obviously, we still want to maximize performance as much as we can, but the consequences are just lower when we're that far out from a meet or a test day, for example, right? So that's really the basic overarching thing there with hypertrophy training, and I'll talk about a couple things here about some special considerations there, and of course in the lectures in the course I go into more detail here, and just for the sake of time I won't get into everything in as much detail, but I do want to at least hit the main things, and that would be that because the training is more focused on hypertrophy, we don't want to get too far from strength either, right? But we do want to maximize that hypertrophic stimulus. So we talk about this a lot with a lot of the stuff we posted before about how it's probably a good idea still maintain some sort of strength stimulus through those training phases, through top sets and things like that. And especially on those days, we want to pay extra attention to how we feel and can we do any nutritional things to maximize performance, especially for those sets that are still keeping the strength stimulus there. And some main things there is one, if we're trying to gain weight, trying to gain muscle, really not a huge deal. You're going to feel pretty good almost all the time. If we are dieting to lose weight, then we usually have some stuff we got to deal with. And there's a lot of factors here too, with, how long have you been dieting? How aggressively are you dieting? Like what rate of body weight loss per week are you seeing? There's a lot of individual difference too. Some people feel great even when they're dieting. Some people immediately feel like garbage, and everywhere in between. So there, a couple main things to do here would be to consider some intermittent dieting strategies. And these are things that are in the literature, we haven't seen really physiological benefits from this yet. There's only been a handful of studies. Even that might be being a little bit generous. But we're not really seeing much physiologically happening, but there are some potential psychological things happening that could at least make adherence to the diet better, and potentially, especially anecdotally, make performance in the gym slightly better when you just have some more food. So to be a little bit more specific here, there's a few different time scales we can do this under. Let's say we have a long diet that we're doing, and it's however many weeks long that we're planning. Maybe it's 12 weeks long or something, right? And we can do what's called a refeed, which is basically 1 to 3 days of higher calories. So you have your normal deficit for most of the week, and then we have a day or a couple days where you bring your calories up kind of towards maintenance, usually through an increase in carbohydrates. That would be called a refeed. We also have that's on a slightly larger scale, what's called a diet break, which is usually 1 to 3 weeks. Similar idea, right? or just bringing calories up kind of towards maintenance, usually from more carbs. And then those are really the things that we're doing within a dieting phase, right? And then we can also break up phases or a long diet into multiple phases and separate them with like a maintenance phase, which is as long as you want of higher calories, right? And that can sort of decrease any diet related fatigue and those sorts of things. So um, again, in the literature, we're not seeing much physiological benefit, meaning we're not really seeing better muscle retention, we're not really seeing better strength performance. But anecdotally, we do hear tons of people talk about the psychological benefits of these things and just feeling more energetic, more just ready to perform on a given day. And even if that's placebo, that's very worth it, right? I don't think you're not losing anything there. So that is one option to consider. And then another one is really paying attention to your nutrition around your training session. And there is three studies, I believe, from Naharudin et al. Over the course of a few years there that were really looking at pre-workout nutrition, and they were finding that it seems to be mostly a psychological thing more so than like substrate availability itself. So that is to say, eating carbs before you train, it may not actually be the carbs that are helping. It's just the fact that you're not hungry and distracted and that sort of thing. So you're able to actually give your full effort in the training session. And I think this is very important for people who are in a fat loss diet, right? Because if anyone has done that to a significant degree, I'm sure you've noticed that you can feel quite hungry and quite distracted and kind of grumpy and all those sorts of things. And then training is not the easiest, thing to accomplish, especially those heavy top sets that are really important to keep in here, especially during a fat loss diet to make sure we don't lose a ton of strength. So that's one thing to consider is that like it might not be from the carbs themselves. It's just eat something to not be super hungry. On the flip side, though, there's been a couple meta-analyses over the last year or two. This most recent one from King et al. That looked at pre-workout carbs, and they were finding that if your session is, I think it was at least 10 hard sets, at least about 45 minutes long, which for most people listening to this, we're going to fall into that category, that it seems like eating, a good amount of carbs before you train is helpful for performance. That being said, we still can't fully separate, is it the carbs themselves or is it just eating something? But nonetheless, it does seem like eating something before you train becomes especially important, especially or is important for performance. But I think it would become especially important if we are in a fat loss diet. So those are kind of the main nutritional things. And in terms of training, what can we do when we're under this sort of overarching catabolic environment from the fat loss diet? I think the biggest thing, and this is similar between, there are some different things, but it's similar between hypertrophy and strength phases, where we're sort of looking at the end of the day, we always want to prioritize performance, right? I think I tried to be really clear about that through the course. That's the concept we're working with, right? So whatever we need to do to accomplish that is what we should do, and whether that is taking slower progressions week to week with load progression or rep progression or however you want to do it, whether it's doing shorter training blocks, just deloading more frequently. There's a lot of options, and some people will need to just even more simply than that, refocus on sleep and stress management and things like that. Right? I think those, we can kind of let those get away from us a little bit when we're trying to gain muscle, or even just at maintenance. They're just the consequences of suboptimal sleep and stress management and things like that. They're just not nearly as much when we're well fed. But when we have this constraint of the energy deficit, I think they become so much more important, and we can feel those consequences much more. And that becomes more pronounced the leaner you get and the longer you've been dieting. So most people listening to this, probably strength athletes, right? And maybe hypertrophy too, but you're probably not going to be doing a bodybuilding show at the end of this diet, right? For most people listening to this. So it's not a massive concern, but it is still something, if you get towards the lower end of your body fat settling point, which is pretty individual, but if you get towards the lower end or even trying to dip below that, then those consequences really can be a bit more pronounced. Um, so anyway, I think that's the main overview for like hypertrophy phases and what I think makes the most sense to do there. Again, just as a general wrap up, I think that's when it makes the most sense to do our body composition changes, whether that's muscle growth or fat loss. Because again, remember, these phases are specifically tailored for muscle growth, right? Like that is the main focus of the training. So why not really lean into that and make the most of that time with the nutrition? So um, there's the hypertrophy phase stuff. Do you guys have any follow ups there before I jump into the strength phases?
Yeah, I think I, I think I want to highlight something about I guess just the general approach you took to this course, and also provide a practical example of it. Is that a lot of this stuff, like, we don't have a ton of research on, and we definitely don't have a ton of research on, 6 months of training for people, that are starting and finishing a training study at the same body weight, and one group kind of does bulk and cut cycles based on the training phase, and one group simply maintains. We definitely don't have those studies, but in the absence of those studies, we still want to give you the best possible recommendations possible. So I think you did a really good job of that, right? You acknowledged how there isn't a ton of research on refeeds, diet breaks, that kind of thing. Um, but for XYZ reasons, I think they're a really good tool to have in your tool belt, and thus made their way into the course, of course, presented with the appropriate level of confidence based on, I guess, the lack of research, or lack of overwhelming research, I guess. And another example of this is Jake just outlined how, in a hypertrophy phase, our general recommendation is to try to lean into um, periods where you're trying to manipulate your body composition. So, in other words, ideally, you spend a hypertrophy phase in a caloric surplus, or if you do want to drop some body fat for a strength athlete, it's a great time to do that in a strength phase, or I'm sorry, in a hypertrophy phase, because the hypertrophy stimulus is so high. Top end performance isn't quite as important. So, thus, it kind of makes sense to, okay, we're going to drop some body fat. Let's try to pair that with a hypertrophy phase, because body composition is the focus. But if you actually look at the research, one might be inclined to say it should be the opposite. So, for example, there is a relatively recent review paper from January of this year, from Murphy et al. And they actually found that strength in the short term is less affected by energy balance, so a purposeful energy deficit or an purposeful energy surplus, than hypertrophy in the short term. So, in other words, it might actually seem like, okay, if strength is less impacted by an energy deficit, maybe we should do our cuts in a strength phase. But from just practical experience, and also considerations from this study, for example, the population, if I recall correctly from this meta-analysis, was like older adults. Um, it's just a totally different ball game than someone trying to peak for a competition, or peak for a big testing day in the gym, or they're just a recreational strength athlete that wants to hit a new 5RM. It's a totally different ball game. So, while this course is very evidence based, and I don't know, there dozens, if not hundreds, of references throughout the course, and stuff that you reference. Um, we're also just not presenting research and saying, okay, now go for it. It's like, okay, we're going to take that into account, but we're also going to kind of triangulate some other evidence, and maybe give recommendations that are the best we can come up with based on practical experience and various lines of research in the meantime. And I think that's a good example, and one I wanted to point out, because my favorite module from this course is module 4, which is called weight management periodization, and it basically talks about things from more of a high level of, okay, over the next whatever 6 to 12 months, or 4 to 12 months, whatever, I want to go up a weight class, or I want to go down a weight class, or I want to maintain a weight class. What should my nutritional approach be throughout those 4 to 12 months to get me to that point? And Jake goes through different options, and I think that module, like, if you bought this course and just watched that module, I'd like to think it's worth the price of admission in and of itself. And we kind of went over the main concepts from it. So if you don't buy the course, that's cool too. Hopefully you get something from this podcast. But pairing your nutrition with the training approaches from a high level based on where you want to be 4 to 12 months, and being proactive about those things, I think is just an absolute game changer. And we did our best to kind of triangulate experience, various lines of research, and hopefully present it in a very practical way. So that sounded way too much like a sales pitch. I don't know if Zach, you have anything to add, Jake, you have anything to add, or Jake, you want to pick up on where I cut you off?
Well, Zach, if you got nothing, I can jump in. All right, cool. I guess the talking about the strength phase stuff will be a bit shorter because we kind of alluded to a lot of it already, right? It's a lot of the things that we're leaning into in the hypertrophy phases we're maybe not doing as much of during strength phases, just because again the training is not specifically tailored to maximize muscle growth, and we also are very concerned with our top end strength performance. So in this case, I think it makes the most sense to either stick somewhere around maintenance, or if you do want to gain or lose weight, just do it very slowly. On that note, also, there's nothing wrong with maintaining during a hypertrophy phase, right? Like it's not like you're wasting time. We know, more recently, we posted quite a bit of stuff about like body recomposition and how it most likely happens more often than was previously expected. I would argue it's probably not as maximized as if you're in an energy surplus, but it's not like you're wasting time completely, right? So that option is on the table, and likewise with strength phases, it's not like maintenance is the only thing that makes sense. In my experience, the the idea of being in a slight surplus during a strength phase with both myself and with clients is training often goes even a little bit better. You just have like that little bit of extra juice to train even harder, and recovery is almost a complete non-issue at that point for most people. But then, of course, you need to account for like we're gaining weight there, and is it optimized for muscle gain versus fat gain? Probably not. So we might gain slightly more fat than we really need to. Is that an issue? That comes down to individual preference. But nonetheless, and then in terms of being in a slight deficit during a strength phase, Josh, you just mentioned that study. There's a bit of a rationale there, and in my experience, also for short time periods, as long as it's a small deficit, we're not seeing huge issues, right? It's just mainly a thing of, is this as good as we can possibly do? I would say probably not, but that doesn't mean it's bad either, right? Like it still is a very valid option, and for people who, if you're trying to compete and you need to make your weight class, and we maybe didn't plan ahead quite as well as we could have, then sometimes this simply is what we have to do. And in that case, there are some training and nutrition considerations here too that I'll talk about that I went into in the course as well. And this is sort of like I don't necessarily recommend having a large deficit during a strength phase, but if we have to do it to make a weight class, then we have to do it. So let's make the best of it, right? So in terms of the nutritional considerations, they're really the same as during hypertrophy phases, right? Like, we want to make sure that psychologically we feel as well as we possibly can, and we can really give our most to the training. But what most, not everybody, but a lot of people find is that these really high loads, especially when you're dieting, can be very fatiguing. And these, weeks or month or two before the meet, a lot of times that's the most fatiguing training that people are undergoing, right? Um, some people would disagree with that. They find the higher volumes more fatiguing, but regardless, so some specific training things that we can do here that I think fit really well in these strength phases are to, one, like I said, with hypertrophy, maybe slower progressions week to week, or maybe shorter training blocks, just deload a bit more frequently, kind of let some of that fatigue, get a release valve for some of that fatigue a little bit more often. And two, what I think that makes maybe even more sense, and something that I've had very, very good luck with, is polarizing training even more. So a lot of times what we do, not just us, but in general in strength training, right, is there's some sort of structure with top sets and then back off work that's at a lighter load or maybe at a lower RPE or something like that. And just kind of leaning into that even more and polarizing those points even more. So maybe the top sets are higher loads or higher RPEs, and then the back off sets are even lower, right? It's even easier, just to really make sure we still get that volume in a good way to do that. As we talked about before, maybe you're accustomed to doing 3 sets of 4 as your back off work, so instead just flip that 4 sets of 3 at the same load. You still get the same total relative volume in, but each set in and of itself is a bit less fatiguing. So overall, it seems like people have a bit better luck with that in terms of managing fatigue. But those are the main things. And I think just, one other thing I want to point out, that I kind of glazed over quickly earlier, was the point about top end strength being the biggest concern here during strength phases, and why we really want to avoid having these harsh diets here, right? Because a lot of people, a surprising number of people in my experience, find themselves in this situation where they're trying to make a certain weight class, and they don't even really think about setting themselves up for that until they're in the meat of of competition prep, right? And all of a sudden they find themselves in the situation where we need to lose 1 or 2 pounds a week during this last month or two, and it's just not, then we get that Instagram post where it's not the day I wanted, but it's whatever, right? So we have fatigue and recovery, and therefore your performance, we want those to be at their absolute most predictable during these strength phases. And a great way to really make that stuff wonky is to be in a harsh deficit, right? So being more, at least a very small deficit, if at all, I think can solve quite a bit of that. We also want to consider, if we're losing or gaining a lot of weight, it can change your leverages through your body. It can make your belt fit differently. It can make your knee sleeves fit differently, and all that stuff can throw off your technique a little bit. And I'm sure people have realized this or have experienced this. When you have a big competition on the horizon, any little change in your psychological outlook about your lifts, how confident you feel in your technique, and all that kind of stuff, any deviation there can really throw a little bit of doubt, into your performance on meet day, and that's not what we want, right? We want the most confident, the most momentum we can possibly have going into a competition or a test day, right? So that's my spiel for strength phases, I guess, and the most basic terms, right? Hypertrophy phases is body composition changes, or maintenance. That's also okay. Strength phases more sort towards maintenance. If we have to do body comp changes, we can, but I would generally recommend not doing that. Last thing I want to kind of talk about is building that longer term plan. And I won't go into crazy detail there for the sake of time, but I do want to touch on it. But do you guys have anything you want to follow up there first, or should I continue?
No, I would just really underscore, like, it's all about that momentum, um, in a strength phase, and putting kind of like theoretical recovery things aside. It's like, if things are a little bit off, and you're not able to catch that momentum or set yourself up for, that big squat 2 weeks out, that really kind of informs attempt selection. I think it can become a slippery slope, and hence our general recommendation to avoid significant weight loss in a strength phase if possible. It was you, Zach, that told me like a very long time ago that it kind of stuck with me. You're like, I kind of think of it as like, you're either doing a you're either going down a weight class, and dropping weight to make weight, or you're doing a meat prep. You can't do both. You have to pick one. And that kind of stuck with me. And I think that's true, right? Like, I you want to be within striking distance of where you can make weight, with that acute weight cut, which is module 5. Um, I'd say, at least one block out, ideally more than that. So yeah, just kind of underscoring some things you said.
Cool. All right. Well, the last thing is sort of putting this together, right? And Josh, you alluded to this, that I think that module 4, the long term planning stuff, is also my favorite, because it's where you really get to meld everything together, and where we get to kind of nerd out over the calendar and planning each phase strategically and all this, right? And during the course, I talked about, like, the goal is for each block to build upon the previous block, right? And for each, likewise, each block to sort of potentiate what we do in the next one. And I think the best way to do that, whether you're competing or not competing, I think they work the same. It's just, if you're not competing, you don't really have to worry about weight class constraints, right? So it's slightly easier in that sense. You don't have to worry about doing a weight cut or not, and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, they are very similar. I think what we should do is plan backwards, right? So if we have a competition date, or if we have a day we want to do a test day in the gym, or maybe we just set some body composition and strength goals for, like, all right, this time next year I want to be this, or whatever, right? Whatever the goal is, we kind of plan backwards from that. So I'll talk about like a meet prep, just because I think it's the most, it has the most things going on, right? So The other options are more simple. So with the meat prep option, we have our meat date. We're planning backwards. If we're going to do a weight cut, we want to make sure we're in position to do a weight cut that's safe and effective and not going to harm our performance. That's the biggest thing. So it seems like, based on the literature we have, and admittedly, there's not a ton of this. A lot of it is on combat sports, right? We don't have a ton of like, squat, bench, and deadlift performance after a weight cut type of research, right? There's barely any. But what we do have seems to suggest that if we can lose roughly 3 to 5% of body mass, we're not going to harm our performance for most people in most situations. The range there is because we have multiple avenues of weight loss that we can manipulate. The main one's probably body water. We can typically lose, 2 to 4% body mass from that. I would generally recommend, and based on the research, that more than 3%, we're really starting to roll the dice in terms of number one, just feeling really bad on the day of the meet, and that distraction and that lack of focus can impact performance. But also just a physiological decrease in performance there too. So I would generally try to avoid going over 3% body mass loss from water. We can usually get another 1 to 2% from losing some glycogen mass. We don't want to lose all of our glycogen mass because we're still lifting weights, but a powerlifting meet in and of itself, even when accounting for warm-up sets, it's just not a super high volume thing, right? We're not running a marathon. We don't need 100% capped off glycogen stores. So we can lose a little bit there, and then another 1 to 2% or so from gut content, right? Gut residue. And those are our main things. If you do the math there, we end up somewhere in that 3 to 5% range of body mass we can lose and not have to worry about performance loss again for most people. I've been experimenting with this this combination of things with my clients competing 2 years or something like that now, and I think I've had one time where somebody had some performance decrease when we kept the water loss under 3%. So it's been very, very rare that that's an issue. So again, that's where I would cap off the water loss. If we want to do glycogen and gut content, we can do that, get a little bit more weight loss. But it's just, what I found is most people hear 5% and they're like, whoa, that's way too much. Probably not the case. We don't want to dehydrate that much, but we can do some other things. Anyway, we want to make sure that we're within that range of doing a weight cut before the meet. So we want to kind of set ourselves up. We want to plan around a week or two out. We want to be no more than 3 to 5% above that weight class cutoff. So then we're kind of planning backwards and saying, okay, I probably want, a strength phase leading into the meet, right? I don't want to do a full-on hypertrophy phase and then try to compete immediately, right? That makes sense. So probably be somewhere around maintenance for that strength phase. And then before that, it's sort of up to the individual, right? Is this somebody who maybe they're a less experienced lifter? We want to spend some more time doing hypertrophy training. Or maybe there's somebody who tends to feel more unpracticed with the lifts if we don't do a lot of strength phases consecutively. Maybe in that situation, we want to do more strength phases, right? So this is very individual, but we're planning backwards these different training phases. That's where I would start, because obviously the training performance is the main goal for that competition. Then we want to look at our body weight and fit the whether it's gaining weight or most likely losing weight for people who are trying to cut down into a lower weight class. We want to kind of use that strategically alongside these training phases, right? So we're looking at our plan and we're like, okay, well, we have these strength phases before the meet, probably more or less maintain there. Maybe I have a hypertrophy phase or a higher volume phase before that, where I'm trying to do, a nice slow and steady fat loss diet to get down into that weight cut range. Then I'll hold that for a while, then do the weight cut, then do the meet. And then, you can continue planning backwards from there, right? With fluctuations up or down. The one thing I would caution people though, when you are doing a fat loss diet and then maintaining and then doing the weight cut to get to the meet, right? When we switch to that maintenance diet during that final strength phase, you're going to gain a little bit of weight back. It might be a little bit of body fat. Most likely it's water and glycogen and all those sorts of things, but just give yourself a little bit more wiggle room, right? Don't be so on the dot with your body weight targets and goals with that you just don't have that wiggle room to gain a little bit more weight. And, then all of a sudden you're in the same situation where we have to diet for a week or two to get that little bit of weight off during that final phase, and that's what we want to avoid. So that's really the biggest thing, right? Is just trying to strategically plan backwards and say, okay, I know a reasonable rate of weight loss and gain that I'll mention here in a second. So I know that for my body weight, I probably don't want to lose or gain more than this much per week. So I need this many weeks to lose this much weight, that sort of thing, right? And we're just planning backwards in these phases. And there are very specific examples through the course, and we're already over half an hour, so I don't really want to bog people down with too many numbers because that's difficult to follow, in this format anyway. But hopefully that makes sense, right? You can sort of plan backwards and have these milestone body weight targets that you're aiming for, and that sort of thing. So to cap that off, I guess the rate that I would recommend for people, and this comes from review articles on the fat loss side from Roberts et al. In 2020. Both of these are fantastic. Highly recommend reading these. But on the weight loss side, we probably don't want to lose more than 0.5 to 1% of body mass per week for most people. Now, there are situations where we can go faster than that or slower than that. And those are very valid options. But as a general recommendation, I'd be somewhere in that 0.5 to 1%. And then on the weight gain side from Iraqi et al. In 2019, we have somewhere in the 0.25 to 0.5% body weight gain per week. And it is slower. Obviously, muscle growth is a slower process than fat loss. And again, there are some situations we can go a bit faster than that. That's a little bit less recommendable, especially for more advanced people, but there still are some situations there where that's fine. And then we can also go slower than that too, right? It's not a bad option. And there's a lot of room for individualizing all of this stuff, but those are some general ranges to shoot for.
Yeah, good stuff, man. I am team slower rate of weight gain. I think we could have a whole podcast just rehashing some previous arguments we've had about this, or I should say discussions. But obviously, in the course, I think we made it pretty clear, or you made it pretty clear that these are general ballpark ranges. Might be helpful to go below them or potentially above them here and there when necessary. But yeah, man, really good stuff. I think whether you're interested in optimizing everything for a powerlifting meet, to use that making weight protocol generator, the course is awesome. But also, if that's not your gig, you're just like trying to get as strong and as jacked as possible in the next year or two or whatever, 80+% of this course is going to be relevant for you. So I think it hits on a good amount of people. And, I'd say modules 1 through 4 are going to be relevant for everyone. Module 5, a little bit more for people interested in the competition side of things, but you can take or leave that, right, if you're not interested. So yeah, I'm excited about this. I think this for a good amount of people that, think through this course, drop comments in the course with any questions they have, and really think about these things and really integrate it. It could be the thing that I don't want to oversell it and say it's that one weird trick, but I do genuinely think that if you're geared with a lot of the information you just talked about, Jake, and obviously it's in more detail in the course, it really can make a meaningful difference, right? And that's what we set out to do with the course. So, yeah. Anything else, fellas?
No, I'll chime in here for 2 seconds. Obviously, I think the one thing I'll say is that I just, looking at the course slides and looking at a lot of the information, I think it just exudes like the degree of passion that went into it, and I just think that's something cool to highlight. Like, I think just from a slightly outsider perspective on it, you guys are the ones that definitely spearheaded this project, and I provided some proofreading and stuff like that where I could give some of my limited knowledge on this stuff compared to you guys for sure. But I think that's just a cool thing to highlight too. I think this is just an awesome project that a lot of time, effort went into, and I think that comes through in the information and the way that it's presented, and obviously was created with helping people, helping lifters as much as possible with everything the way it was created. So that's definitely something I want to highlight from my perspective to definitely take that into account. You're going to learn a ton of cool stuff, and that is definitely was the way that it was created and the way that it was fostered from the ground up. So I think that's pretty cool.
All right, Jake. You have 30 seconds for a sales pitch. Take it or leave it, because I'm cringing. I feel like we've sold it too hard.
Man, I don't know. We worked hard. It's cool. Buy it. I don't know. No, but it was really fun to make. Like Zach said, I in particular, I think, am really passionate about the nutrition side of things, coming from more of a bodybuilding background and then getting into powerlifting and trying to, like, man, these guys don't pay attention to their nutrition. That's weird. And then we, trying to put everything together, and um, it just is a lot of fun to synthesize all that stuff, and like you guys said, we found it to be very, very helpful for people. So not just the course, but also those extra downloadable tools that we made that people get access to. Like Josh, you mentioned the weight cutting calculator and all of that. Very excited for those, and I think that this is great, not just for lifters but also for coaches, right? Like I tried to, wherever I could, also bring that into the course content, talking about how to use this for your clients. I think that's also I hope, very helpful for people. It's at least been helpful for me. In my experience, I'm like, man, if it helped me, it's probably going to help some other people. So there you go. Over 30 seconds, but that's all right.
Right on. All right. I think that's all we have on that front. So Zach, we'll turn to you, man, and we'll talk about some drop set stuff. So a recent meta-analysis came out from Coleman and colleagues on drop sets versus traditional straight set training. And I think this, Zach, reading your newsletter, I think changed my mind a little bit on some things, which is cool. So yeah, I'll kick it to you and let you dive into this.
Sure. So, like you said, the most recent newsletter was about drop sets, and I kind of centered this one around a recent meta-analysis by Coleman and colleagues. And for the most part, I tried to look at things. Spoiler alert for something I'll talk about here in a second, but there wasn't super interesting findings on the front end, right? Like if you just look at the overall effect estimates for both strength and hypertrophy, there wasn't really much going on. Very similar adaptations for drop sets versus traditional straight set training. But where I think the newsletter hopefully was helpful is I kind of broke down things in a different way of looking at optimizing training. So when we talk about training, talk about different ways, different levers that we can pull with a lot of the different variables. Almost always what we're talking about is just sheer absolute maximization of progress. And I think a lot of the times that's a useful lens to talk about things from, right? Like that's our audience, most of us. That's how we kind of think about things. But I think it's clear to be clear. It's important to mention that that's not the only way that you can view optimization. And I think particularly what I focus on for this newsletter is viewing optimization through the lens of efficiency. So by that, all I mean is that what is going to allow us to maximize the rate of progression relative to something. So whether the example I think I gave in the newsletter was, if something gives me 2 more kilos of a strength increase in my squat, let's say 10 kilos versus 12 kilos, but it takes triple the amount of time. For many people, that would not be worth it, basically, is the kind of the idea of efficiency versus absolute maximization of progress there. The 12 kilo increase is definitely greater. So that in a true absolute optimization sense, that would be more of an effect. But if you're considering that relative to the amount of time invested, it's not as efficient as the other consideration of 10 kilos. So that's kind of the lens that I talked about this through. And I talked about that relative to both just the amount of time invested, but then also per set. And I think both of those kind of shed 2 slightly different pictures on drop set training and kind of how we can think about it. So just as like a very brief overview of drop set kind of history, I think bodybuilders have kind of used this for a really long time. And I think that kind of fits in line with their kind of, mental model for the most part of hypertrophy. A lot of times they were kind of chasing more of the pump or the muscle swelling, things like that were associated with like perceived quality of a training session. And a lot of these intensity techniques kind of fall in line with that. Now, the more that we've kind of at least dug in a little bit and understanding the mechanisms of hypertrophy, I think we're still a long way to go, but probably isn't necessarily the best way to go about things predominantly hypertrophy seems to be driven by mechanical tension, although probably not the only factor. So purely chasing things like the pump and stuff like that probably isn't the best way to go. Now, with that in mind, that doesn't mean drop sets don't have efficacy. And that's why I was saying that I predominantly focus on this from an efficiency perspective. So what this meta-analysis did, like we said, focus on studies that compared drop set training. So just to define drop sets real quick, I start a series of sets with 100 kilos, do that for 10 reps. Then I'm going to drop the load by approximately 15%, do another little mini set, drop the load a little bit more, do another little mini set. Whereas traditional straight set training is I would just be using 100 kilos or approximately thereof for all 3 sets. Those are the kind of comparison that we're working with. In the meta-analysis, there were 5 studies that kind of met the criteria that the authors set out. And overall, without going into much of the statistical details, this was extremely well done. And overall, that I thought the methods were really, really sound. And so getting to the findings here for both in hypertrophy and strength, the effect estimates both sat really close to 0, basically saying that you are going to have comparable muscle growth and strength gains between drop sets and traditional straight set training. And they offer basically drop sets are a viable alternative to straight set training as far as what was included in the meta-analysis. So the question then becomes, okay, so what can we glean from this? There doesn't seem to be much of a difference, but how does that actually, influence our practical recommendations with this kind of stuff? And so that's where I kind of, like I said, focus on the 2 different realms of efficiency. And so I went through all the studies that were included and I calculated just estimated training times. And then I also calculated how many sets per week. And in some cases, I made a few estimations on details that were omitted from the methods to kind of calculate how many sets per week they were doing. To be clear, I counted all drops as their own set. And the reason that I did that is because pretty much in every single case, from what I could tell, loads were greater than 30% of 1RM. And because of that, almost all sets were probably greater than 5 reps. And so for the most part, those are going to be counted as a set. The proximity to failure discussion wasn't perfectly defined in all cases, but it's kind of impossible to know that in some of these situations. So I just counted them all as their own individual sets per little mini drop. So with all of that said, looking at kind of the little estimations that I did, it was pretty clear that drop set training, when we're considering the absolute amount of estimated training time, was definitely more efficient. So I'm looking for the exact number that I calculated here. So based on my estimations, where I basically treated a main set, so a traditional set, or kind of the first set of a drop set series as 1 minute of time, and all drop sets are about 30 seconds of time, it was about 53% less training time. So that is basically saying that it's offering you very similar adaptations for about half the training time, which is going to be obviously a huge win in favor of drop sets, showing that they're a very viable alternative to straight set training and offer really similar adaptations. And so that's really cool. However, where I think there's a slightly different nuance is when we're looking at things per set. Most of the time, the drop set conditions actually did more sets. So they were doing it in a shorter amount of time, but they had to complete more sets to get these similar adaptations. And so on average, it was about 32% greater number of sets to achieve those similar adaptations. So what this means is that in an absolute sense, drop sets are more efficient, but on a per set basis, so relative to the number of sets you're performing, they maybe are a little bit less efficient. And so I think this is interesting when it gets to kind of the practical implementation of these ideas, specifically for drop sets, but I'll kind of stop there and see if you guys have any questions or anything before I keep rolling here.
I think you can keep rolling. I have a couple things to discuss, but I think it'd be better if you maybe wrap up and then we could get to them unless Jake wants to jump in.
Cool. Okay. So as far as like the practical implementation of what these kind of ideas lead to here, I think I'm going to separate into strength and hypertrophy as far as I'm concerned. So for strength, I think looking at the kind of the details of the individual studies, peak loading, and then in some cases, average loading almost entirely explains the strength findings. So it seems like you can perform one very high load set to kind of start a drop set series. And that, for the most part, is going to explain the differences in strength gains pretty well. So if you wanted to optimize strength outcomes, performing a high load set to kind of start that series of drops, and then maybe altering the percentage that you're dropping to kind of get you back down to more like a hypertrophy oriented rep range, probably is going to be your best bet there. So strength gains are really as simple as that. For the most part, peak load is what seems to best predict these outcomes. Average load, maybe on the fringes. If there's very large differences in average loading between the traditional set condition versus the drop set condition, that did seem to play a factor in some of the studies. But for the most part, I think peak load is where you want to focus. For hypertrophy, I think the overall findings kind of make sense. For the most part, the per set thing is where I want to focus, because I think this ties into some of the rest interval research pretty well. So the important thing to state here is that it isn't perfectly logical inference to state that drop sets are indeed less efficient based on these studies. So we're missing a kind of key experimental design to actually be able to test this directly. And so that would be where we have a study that has 3 groups. One that has like a traditional set group where they, let's say they do 4 sets in a session. Another one would be a set volume equated drop set group where they do 1 main set followed by 3 drops. And then finally, a non-set volume equated drop set group where they roughly increase the number of sets by around that 30% that I estimated. So 1 main set followed by 5 drop sets. That would actually directly tell you if there was a difference between the set volume and non-set volume equated drop set groups, or not a difference, whether or not drop sets are indeed less efficient, because we're basically just making a guess, which I think is well supported, and I'll touch on that in a second, that drop sets are actually less efficient per set because they saw similar adaptations to a group performing less sets, basically is the assumption there. However, it also could be that there is just a plateauing of adaptation at that given amount of sets. So it's not necessarily that the drop sets are definitely less efficient. It's just that they're doing more sets when they don't really have to. So that is also a very plausible explanation of what's going on. So we need that 3rd study to directly test it. But like I said, I do think there's some other evidence we can kind of point to that probably provides a little bit of support here. So there's another study by Longo and colleagues. I think we've touched on the podcast before. They basically had 4 groups. One group did all their training, I believe 3 sets per session with long rest intervals. Another group did all their training with short rest intervals that were about 1 minute long, same amount of sets. And then there were 2 other groups that equated volume to either the long rest or the short rest group with the opposite rest interval. So to break that down, the one group that's probably the most interesting still did short rest intervals. So they did 1 minute rest intervals, but they added a few more sets to equate volume to the long rest interval condition. And what they saw is that while the short rest interval condition that performed the same number of sets to the group that was performing long rest intervals, so both 3 sets, one with 3 minute rest, one with 1 minute rest, the 1 minute rest condition there did grow less. When they performed a few extra sets to compensate for the volume loss, the muscle growth seemed to be rescued, and it was very similar between groups. So what that shows is that shorter rest intervals that are going to be featured in drop sets probably blunt the hypertrophic potential that you get from a set. And I think that applies very similarly to drop sets here, meaning that if you're going to ask me to put myself on one side of the fence, I would probably say on a per set basis that drop sets are a bit less efficient. But importantly, that doesn't seem to nullify the fact that they are still, in an absolute sense, more time efficient. It's just that when you're setting up a time-oriented protocol change to kind of make things a little bit more efficient, you may want to add 1 or 2 sets to try to have equivalent outcomes to what you were doing before, as kind of a safe bet at this point, until we see from future evidence whether or not they are indeed less efficient by that additional experimental design that we would need. But that's kind of the overall thing. So to hit those tangents hit those points one more time. On an absolute sense, drop sets do seem to provide very similar adaptations to straight set training, although do so in considerably less time. However, in a relative sense, they may be a little bit less efficient per set, so you may want to compensate by adding a few more sets. And that's predominantly for hypertrophy. And then for strength, as long as you're performing, the first main set prior to the drops with a relatively high peak load that's specific to the strength test that you're looking to improve, you're probably going to be checking your boxes there, and then going to put yourself in a really good position.
Good stuff, man. Yeah, I think overall the fact that this meta-analysis found equal outcomes between the drop set protocols and the traditional straight set protocols, like, yeah, to some degree it's not like a super flashy finding, but that's important in and of itself.
Mm.
um my perception is that they could be underutilized, and I would say, in reflecting on it for myself and in my coaching practice, um I probably underutilized them just based on kind of what you talked about here. Like, it saved a lot of time. That's A lot of people are constrained by time. That's important to know. So I would really underscore that, and also the fact that the strength outcomes were similar is pretty crazy. Um, on one hand, are these it's analogous to like the trying to infer whether periodization is good for hypertrophy by looking at um, periodization studies that are designed for strength. But to some degree, it might be some indication of how important peak loading is. But again, probably not the best evidence, but it might be some evidence to just kind of keep in the back of your mind of how important peak loading might be in the absence of research that actually looks at peak loading how we would want it to look. Um, but yeah, man, one thing I wanted to get your guys' take on, and I think this is going to be pretty subjective or just kind of speculating here. So you talked about efficiency in two different scenarios, or in two different contexts. The first is in terms of time, right? Um, Overall, it seems like drop sets are probably more efficient from a time perspective. The second one is in terms of number of sets. Although drop sets are more efficient in terms of total time, they're probably less efficient in terms of total sets. However, what do you guys think about efficiency in terms of fatigue? So my thinking on this is like, okay, to me, this is almost like a no-brainer to do drop sets, at least to some degree, if it's more efficient from a time perspective, or myo reps, or just short rest training or something. But I do wonder if there are downstream effects that might make you want to avoid doing this at least full throttle, right? Perhaps it is the case that if you just make all of your single joint movement drop set work, your total volume tolerance is lower and you're always sore all the time. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that right off the bat.
That's exactly why I wanted to do both the time and the per set thing, because that was exactly my thinking. Um, on paper, when you see the time difference, like you said, absolute no brainer. Why would I not get the exact same results for 50% less time? You can either spend that time doing other stuff. The training geeks in us are probably thinking I can spend 50% of my time doing other training, whether that's more training for the same muscle group, training for other muscle groups, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I have a strong suspicion that there is a non-negligible increase in, call it fatigue, call it strain, call it monotony, something from just doing more sets, independent of anything of what the sets are. Um, I don't know how I can support that other than trust me, bro. Like I don't really think I have a good reason other than that, but I have a strong suspicion that is the case. So I think, just like you said, Josh, this is a tool that I think is definitely attractive and something you can definitely feel, relatively confident pulling that lever when you need it. But I probably wouldn't go out of my way to literally make everything, or even a vast majority of things, drop sets, because I think there probably is that non-negligible increase in, over the long term, strain, monotony. I don't know what to call it, from doing those a few additional sets, that I think could have some deleterious effects that kind of wash out some of the benefits in the very long term. But I think doing, 25, 33%, maybe even a little bit more of your training, particularly your single joint exercises where you can literally just, pull a pin and change it really quick. Like though I see very minimal downside in that scenario, but I'm thinking, squat rack, hit a single, strip it 50%, hitting 3-4 back offsets like that. I just don't really see that going well. And in the majority of the studies, I don't think that those are the exercise utilized. There was a few that did use like squats and stuff that just sounds absolutely terrible. But yeah, that was exactly my thinking of why I wanted to do both the time and the per set thing. The per
Mhm.
set thing is a way more concrete way of getting my opinion across, that there's probably something to hold us back from just doing this on everything. But I thought that if I could just put my totally emotional argument on there, probably don't want to do it for everything, because I think there are non-negligible deleterious effects that could accumulate over the long term if you're accounting for some of those things from just simply doing more sets. I think there's probably things to consider with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. If I'm designing a like max efficiency training program, there's going to be drop sets, but it's not only going to be drop sets. I'll probably turn to antagonist paired supersets first. So something like chest press with rows, right? That I feel is a little bit safer for the meat of your training, especially if you're focused on strength. But yeah, man, like I think this is a really good tool, and again, kind of shifted the way I think about drop sets a little bit.
I think the way that I really like that thought, and the thing that came to mind for me is kind of like a tier list of, depending on the situation you find yourself in. So like antagonist paired supersets are 100% the number one time saving strategy. But if you're in a commercial gym where it's kind of difficult to get two machines basically to use for, I don't know how many sets you're going to do, that can be a situation that's a little bit more difficult. Then I'm probably going to rest pause or drop sets, just because you can stay on the leg extension and knock it all out before you go to the chest press or whatever. And it's essentially seems to be a similar effect. I would agree that antagonist supersets are probably a bit more favorable, particularly for strength. But if that is logistically not feasible, I think drop sets, rest pause fit very nicely in that slot to fulfill a similar purpose. So that's kind of how I think about it too. You got your main movements, squat, something else, maybe you go antagonist or like full body, upper body movements. And then maybe for your accessory exercises that you got to hog a machine for a little bit, maybe you go to some of these other intensity techniques like drop sets, rest pause, what have you.
Sweet.
I like it. Fits my bodybuilding bias, so I like it.
Nice. Very last thought is I would be curious. You mentioned like next steps for drop sets. I would be very curious to see it combining traditional training with drop set training compared to a traditional only group and a drop set only group. I would love to see more research in other areas too, combining traditional training with things like blood flow restriction, combining traditional training with myo reps, and see if there's an additive benefit. Um, Man, when you get into the methodology of fiber specific hypertrophy, it's just hard to make any conclusions about what the heck is going on there. Um, and I think there's some indication that there might be an additive effect of BFR training. While Zach was talking, I dug up a study from Yasuda and colleagues from 2011, and the results did lean in favor of a group combining BFR and traditional training um, compared to just traditional training. Definitely not enough research there to have any strong claims, but I think that would be something I'm really interested in, is can we get an additive effect? Because at the end of the day, the stimulus is just different than straight
That's
sets.
it's literally been like ever since I went through the accommodating resistance stuff for that webinar, I've just been realizing that's a comment I have about more and more things. Like I completely understand why a vast majority of the time researchers do one thing versus the other. Like it makes sense. You're looking for differential effects to further probe with later studies that are a little bit more ecologically valid. But yeah, it's just like you find whatever, like I'm just going to use the accommodating resistance example because it's the one that I'm thinking about. It's like, is doing every single one of my sets with accommodating resistance versus every single one of my sets with just a barbell back squat going to be better or worse for barbell back squatting? It's like, that's not how people do it. You know what I mean? Like it's, you want to combine approaches to allow yourself to actually investigate those effects in a similar way. And I think that's the case here as well. Is like, yeah, you're probably not going to do drop sets on bench press and back squat, particularly if you care about strength. But as soon as we go to the second half of the training session where we're just trying to accumulate some low cost volume like that, absolutely is a study I'd love to see. And I think just those more combined approaches of interventions as opposed to black and white thinking is something I've definitely been thinking about a lot of different areas. And I think this is absolutely one of them.
Sweet. Anything else, fellas?
No.
All right. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. Again, if you are interested in the nutritional periodization course, you can use the code LAUNCH30 for 30% off. We'll keep that live for a little bit more, but hop in before we take that discount, that initial launch discount down. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you're not already subscribed to the Training Takeaway newsletter, you can sign up. That link will be in the description as well. And we'll see you guys next time. Take care.
Thanks, guys.